Hello everyone, welcome to week 9. We're going to start module 5 this week, which is going to be a 3-week module unlike the previous modules, focusing on recommendation systems. Before we get into that, some announcements for this week. First, assignment 4 for module 4 is due on November 10th, that's in 2 weeks. This is about your clustering assignment. For the semester project though, note that the intermediate report is due next week, so you should be working on that. I talked last week about what that entails. Primarily is demonstrating that you've made progress not just on data collection, but also analysis, and letting your classmates know or see where you are in the course of answering the larger questions that you set out to answer in your proposal. For this week, in the beginning of our study on recommendation systems, we have a few learning objectives. The first is to provide at least 3 examples of recommendation systems on the web. Now, RecSys is super popular on the web. Decision support is a hugely important thing. There are a bunch of examples of this that you'll get to in the actual lecture. Then we need to be able to contrast content-based systems versus collaborative filtering-based systems for recommendation. Content-based systems looking at the text of a message or the content of an image or the makeup of a movie, actors, genre, etc. versus collaborative filtering, which is more socially oriented. What kind of content is liked by other people like you, and using that social information potentially in combination with content methods to provide recommendations, which turns out to be significantly more performant than content-based methods alone. Then I'll have you describe at least 2 methods for characterizing an item's content. So we've talked about dimensionality reduction and shingling and a number of other sort of text analysis pieces. Here we actually get to talk about those. And then finally, explain at least 1 aggregation to characterize a user's item preferences. So what is this going to look like in terms of matrices that define implicit feedback things like likes and dislikes on Reddit, or a number of stars in IMDb, these kinds of questions. In week 2, we're going to move on and focus specifically on collaborative filtering. I want you to be able to describe a couple of methods, item to item or user to user methods for collaborative filtering. Then we'll talk about distance measures between users and items. How do we actually measure how far away 2 users are? Since we've already talked about distance metrics, this should be relatively straightforward. And then be able to implement some baseline based on global information. So one of the things that we talk about is how difficult it might be to beat the global baseline, which is basically what is the most popular item globally. Most people are going to want that singular item. There's a bunch of examples of this. So what's the #1 hit on the Billboard? Most people are going to want to listen to that song. What's the most commonly purchased item at a grocery store? Milk and bread, for instance. How do you beat that from a recommendation systems perspective? Then in week 3, we're going to talk more about evaluation for recommendation systems and talk about how collaborative filtering was used to win the Netflix prize. You actually get to see collaborative filtering in action. As with every other module, there's a discussion forum for this, so you can post any questions you have about collaborative filtering or content-based recommendation or recommendation systems in general there. I will make one note: the real difference between recommendation systems, as we've discussed, or as we will discuss this week, and all the work that we've done up to this point about item similarity or finding similar nodes in a graph, the main difference here with recommendation is that recommendation is meant to use historical information about users' preferences. So what has a particular user liked in the past, and how can you use that information to identify what they might like in the future or provide them something similar to their tastes. So that's the big difference. If you're not using users' previous behaviors, then you're not really doing recommendation systems. All right, for next week, we'll continue into recommendation systems. For this week, you should have read sections 9.1 and 9.2. For next week, you should read sections 9.3. And then for week 3, you'll read section 9.4. Note, remember that your intermediate report is due next week. So that's all I have for announcements this week. The recommendation systems first part of lecture is now available, as well as the links for lecture for the rest of this module. All of that is available on Canvas. If you have any questions about any of this, your medium assignments, or your semester project, feel free to reach out via email or drop by office hours tomorrow.